The wine glass trembled on the tray, and Marin Ashby steadied it with 2 fingers before it tipped, because in 6 years of fine dining service, she had learned that a single spilled glass could end a night faster than a kitchen fire. The dining room of Varian hummed with its usual Friday tension, hushed conversation, and the clink of silver against porcelain, candlelight throwing long shadows across white tablecloths that cost more to launder than most people's rent. She moved through it the way she moved through everything, controlled, precise, invisible when she needed to be, and impossible to ignore when the moment called for it. She was 29 years old, and she had chosen this job the way she chose everything, deliberately. Culinary school had not worked out the way she planned. Funding had run out 2 semesters before her final certification, but she had discovered something almost as satisfying in the choreography of service itself, the ability to read a table before it knew what it wanted, to defuse tension with a perfectly timed refill, to make the impossible feel effortless.
She was good at her job.
She was, according to her manager, the best server Varian had, and that reputation was about to become a problem. Table 12, her manager Priya said, appearing at her elbow with the particular tightness in her voice that meant trouble. He's here again. Marin did not need to ask who he was. Everyone on staff knew who occupied Table 12 on the 2nd and 4th Friday of every month, a private corner booth shielded by a half-wall of frosted glass, close enough to the kitchen for quick service, and far enough from the rest of the room to keep prying eyes at bay. 3 servers had already quit over that table in the past year. One had cried in the walk-in freezer after being sent back twice for water that was, in his exact words, the wrong temperature. Another had simply stopped showing up for her scheduled shift the week after serving him, and no one on staff had heard from her since, though Priya insisted, a little too quickly, that the woman had simply moved to another city. Not it, Marin said immediately. Grace called in sick. Devon's on the private party upstairs. It's you or it's me, and I have a reservation of 11 arriving in 20 minutes that I cannot leave. Priya's eyes carried the particular desperation of a manager with no remaining options.
Please.
You're the only one who hasn't broken under him yet. That's because I haven't served him yet. Then, tonight's the night. Priya was already walking away, which was managerial code for the conversation being over whether Marin liked it or not. She smoothed the front of her black apron, rolled her shoulders back the way she did before walking into any room that intimidated her, and crossed the dining floor toward the frosted glass partition with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, which annoyed her more than it frightened her. She had served senators. She had served a famous actor who threw a fork at a busboy over undercooked risotto. She was not going to let one more difficult man rattle 6 years of professional composure. He was seated with his back to the wall, which she noted immediately, the position of a man who did not like surprises approaching from directions he could not see. The suit was the first thing that registered, charcoal gray, cut so precisely to his frame that it looked less like clothing and more like something he had been poured into. His hands rested on the table, still, fingers loosely laced, and there was something about that stillness that made her pulse do something strange and unwelcome in her throat. He did not look up when she approached. He was studying the wine list like it had personally offended him. "Good evening," she said, setting a water glass down with the exact, silent precision that 6 years of training had drilled into her. "My name is Marin. I'll be taking care of you tonight." He looked up then, and the first thing she registered was his eyes, dark and unreadable, the kind that gave away nothing and absorbed everything, cataloging her in the space of a single glance the way she imagined a man might assess a room for exits. There was a thin scar along his left eyebrow, pale and old, and his black hair was cut close and precise, not a strand out of place. "You're new," he said. It was not a question. "I'm not, actually. I've just never had the pleasure of your table." Something flickered behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "The pleasure remains to be seen." "I've heard that about you," she said, and then wondered immediately if that had been the wrong thing to say, but there was no taking it back now, so she simply held his gaze and waited. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched taut enough that she could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. What have you heard? That you sent someone back to the kitchen twice over water temperature. The water was warm. I do not tolerate carelessness. He said it without apology, a simple statement of fact. What is your name again? Marin. Marin. He said it slowly, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth, weighing it the way he might weigh a piece of information he intended to keep. I will have the wine list back in a moment. Bring me still water.
Cold.
Not from the tap chiller, from the bottle in the back that has been properly refrigerated. I'll make sure of it myself. She turned before he could say anything else, and she was 3 steps away when she heard him say, quietly, almost to himself, but pitched just loud enough for her to catch it, finally. She did not know what that meant, not yet, but something about the words settled low in her stomach and stayed there through the rest of the shift. His name, she learned before the night was over from the hushed, wide-eyed gossip of the kitchen staff, was Jiho Kwon, and the restaurant industry in this city ran on an unspoken understanding that his table was not simply reserved, it was untouchable, protected by an arrangement between Varian's owner and an organization no one on staff discussed directly, but everyone understood the shape of. He controlled territory that stretched from the docks to half the financial district, and he came to Varian twice a month not for the food, the sous chef told her in a low voice while plating a dessert, but because it was one of the only rooms in the city where no one dared approach him without an appointment. She served him for the rest of that night with the same practiced precision she gave every table, and if her hands were steadier than she expected them to be given everything the kitchen staff had whispered, she chose not to examine that too closely. He ordered sparingly, ate slowly, and watched the room the entire time in a way that made her wonder if he had ever once, in his adult life, sat somewhere without cataloging every exit and every stranger's hands. When he left, he tipped in cash, folded once and placed beneath the edge of his plate rather than left carelessly on the table, and the amount made her blink twice before she pocketed it. You survived, Priya said when Marin clocked out that night, disbelief evident in every syllable. Grace lasted 4 minutes before he made her cry. You lasted the whole service. He wasn't that bad. He is never that bad to you, Priya said, if he decides he likes you. That is not the same thing as him being an easy man to serve, Marin. Be careful. She should have listened to that warning more carefully than she did. Instead, over the following weeks, she found herself assigned to table 12 on every second and fourth Friday without ever formally requesting it, an arrangement that seemed to have solidified itself without anyone consulting her directly. Jiho arrived precisely on time, always alone or accompanied by a silent, watchful man named Taeyong who sat 2 tables away rather than beside him, and always requested her by name at the host's stand before he was even seated. Their exchanges grew, slowly, into something that was not quite conversation and not quite silence either. He asked her, one Friday, why she had chosen restaurant work over the culinary career her uniform's small embroidered credentials suggested she had once trained for. Life doesn't always go where you plan it, she said, refilling his glass with the same precision she gave every pour. I found something I was good at. That was enough. That is not an answer. That is a wall. Then consider it a wall you're not getting past tonight. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted into what she was slowly learning to recognize as respect, rare and carefully rationed. I like walls, he said. They mean something is worth protecting behind them. She thought about that sentence longer than she should have, long after her shift ended, long after she had gone home to her small apartment and lain awake staring at the ceiling. There was something dangerous in the way he noticed things, the way his attention felt less like being watched and more like being seen, fully and precisely, in a way that unsettled her more than his reputation ever had. She told herself, more than once, that this was simply professional curiosity, the natural interest anyone might feel toward a regular customer whose life was so visibly different from her own. She was not, she told herself, developing feelings for a man whose name made grown-line cooks lower their voices. She was lying to herself, and some part of her already knew it. The following month brought 2 more Fridays of the same careful, escalating rhythm, small conversations stretched a little longer each time, his questions growing a fraction more personal, her answers a fraction less guarded than she intended them to be. She learned that he read history for pleasure, that he disliked crowded rooms despite building his entire life around commanding them, that he had a habit of turning his water glass a quarter turn before he drank from it, a small ritual she found herself watching for without meaning to. He learned, in turn, that she had grown up 2 neighborhoods over from the restaurant, that she sent half of every paycheck to a mother who had raised her alone, that she had never once, in 6 years of service, allowed a difficult table to see her rattled. "You are the only person in this city who does not seem afraid of me," he told her on the second Friday of that second month, and there was something almost wondering in the observation, like a man noting a phenomenon he could not fully explain. "I'm not most people." "No," he agreed, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse climb despite every instinct telling her to look away first. "You are not." It was on the 4th Friday of the following month that everything changed, and it changed the way disasters always seemed to in her experience, without warning, and entirely too fast. Varian was at full capacity, every table occupied, the low hum of a successful Friday service filling the dining room, when the front doors were kicked open with enough force to shatter the decorative glass panel beside the frame. Marin was 3 steps from table 12, tray balanced on one palm, when the first gunshot cracked through the air and the entire room dissolved into screaming chaos. She dropped instinctively, tray clattering somewhere behind her, years of nothing preparing her for this except some deep animal wiring that told her the floor was safer than standing. Across the dining room, she saw 4 men in dark clothing moving with purpose through the tables, not toward the exits, not toward the register, but toward table 12, toward Jiho. Taeyong was already moving, a gun appearing in his hand from beneath his jacket with a speed that suggested this was not the first time he had needed to produce it, but he was 2 tables away, and the men closing on Jiho's booth were closer. Jiho himself had not panicked. He had risen from his seat in one fluid motion, overturning the heavy wooden table onto its side as cover with an ease that suggested significant practice, and from somewhere inside his jacket produced a weapon of his own. Marin's mind raced through the layout of the dining room with the same practiced precision she used to navigate a full service, and she understood, in the space of a single breath, that the emergency exit behind the wine cellar door was close enough to reach, and that the panel controlling the dining room's lighting was mounted on the wall directly behind her, within arm's reach if she moved now. She moved. She slammed her palm against the master switch, plunging the entire dining room into sudden, disorienting darkness broken only by the muzzle flash of gunfire and the dim emergency lighting along the floor, and in that half-second of confusion, she heard one of the attackers curse in surprise, his rhythm broken, his aim thrown off by a darkness he had not planned for. "This way," she hissed toward the sound of Jiho's voice, low and near the overturned table, and she felt rather than saw him turn toward her. "Get down," he said, but she was already moving, staying low, guiding him by instinct and memory of a floor plan she had walked 1,000 times toward the service corridor that led to the kitchen, a corridor none of the attackers would know existed unless they had cased the building far more thoroughly than tonight's chaos suggested they had. Around them, the dining room had become a maze of screaming patrons and overturned chairs, someone's champagne flute shattering somewhere close, the distinct, wet sound of a body hitting the floor that Marin refused to let herself process until later. She kept low, one hand fisted in the fabric of Jiho's sleeve, guiding him with a certainty she did not entirely feel, trusting 6 years of muscle memory over the panic clawing at the edges of her focus. They burst through the swinging kitchen doors together, Jiho's hand closing hard around her wrist as he pulled her behind a steel prep table, and for a moment the sounds of the dining room, screaming, gunfire, overturned furniture, felt distant and unreal behind the solid barrier of the kitchen wall. "Who taught you to move like that?" His voice was low, rough with adrenaline, his dark eyes finding hers in the dim emergency lighting of the kitchen. 6 years of service work. You learn a room's exits fast when you're the one responsible for evacuating it during a fire drill. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. "There's a loading door behind the walk-in freezer. It leads to the alley." "Show me." She led him through the narrow kitchen, past overturned pots and abandoned stations where the line cooks had fled at the first gunshot, toward the heavy steel loading door at the back. Before she reached it, the swinging kitchen doors behind them slammed open, and one of the attackers, a broad-shouldered man with a scar bisecting his upper lip, stepped through with his weapon already raised. Ji-ho moved before she could fully process the threat, stepping in front of her with an economy of motion that felt almost choreographed, his own weapon raised and fired in a single fluid motion that dropped the attacker before the man's finger had fully closed on his trigger. The sound of it cracked through the enclosed kitchen space, sharp and final, and Marin felt her ears ring in the sudden silence that followed. "Move," Ji-ho said, and there was nothing gentle in the command, only the flat urgency of a man who had done this before and intended to survive doing it again. She moved. They emerged into the alley behind, varying into cold night air that felt shockingly ordinary after the chaos inside, and Ji-ho pulled her flush against the brick wall beside the door, his body angled protectively between her and the alley's open end, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him in waves, close enough that his breath stirred the loose strands of hair near her temple. "Stay here," he said, low, his eyes scanning the alley in both directions with a swift, practiced efficiency of a man reading a battlefield. "Do not move from this wall." Who were they? Choi's people. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing beneath skin that had gone tight with fury. "He has wanted my territory for 2 years. He finally decided a public restaurant was worth the exposure to take it." "He attacked a restaurant full of civilians to get to you?" "Yes." Ji-ho said it without softening it, and something in the plainness of the admission made the danger of the situation land with new, cold weight in her chest. "And now that you helped me survive it, he will assume you matter to me. That makes you a target as well, whether either of us wanted that or not." The words settled over her like a physical weight. She had not thought, in the chaos of the moment, about consequences beyond the immediate need to move and to survive. Now, standing pressed against a brick wall in a dark alley beside a man whose enemies had just tried to kill him in front of 200 witnesses, she understood exactly how far the ground beneath her had shifted in the space of 10 minutes. "I need to know you're going to be safe," he said, and the roughness in his voice was not the roughness of command anymore. It was something closer to fear, carefully suppressed but not entirely hidden. "I have spent 2 years keeping my world away from anyone who is not already inside it. Tonight that ended, and I did not choose for it to end this way." "I didn't choose it either." She met his eyes steadily despite the tremor still working through her hands. "But I'm not sorry I turned off those lights." Something shifted in his expression, an openness she had not seen from him in the weeks of clipped conversation and carefully rationed respect, and for a moment the careful control he wore like armor slipped entirely. "No one has ever done something like that for me without being paid or ordered to." "I wasn't thinking about payment. I was thinking about not watching someone die in the middle of my dining room. That is not the same thing as choosing to save a stranger's life at the risk of your own." His hand found her jaw, gentle in a way that felt entirely at odds with the gun still holstered against his side, and the violence, not yet finished tonight. "You should be terrified of me right now." "I am," she admitted. "I'm also still standing here." Taeyong found them minutes later, breathless, one sleeve of his jacket torn but otherwise unharmed, reporting in low, clipped tones that the remaining attackers had fled once police sirens became audible in the distance, that the restaurant's owner was already working to keep this contained and quiet, and that Choi's men had left behind enough evidence to make retaliation not just possible but expected within days. The 3 of them left through a service alley 2 blocks over, avoiding the police cordon now forming around Varian's front entrance, and Marin found herself, an hour later, in the back seat of a car she did not recognize, headed toward a part of the city she had never had reason to visit, still wearing her server's apron, still processing the fact that she had just helped a Mafia boss escape an assassination attempt with nothing but a light switch and her memory of a kitchen floor plan. "You cannot go home tonight," Ji-ho said, watching her from across the car's dim interior. "Choi's people will have already identified you from tonight's chaos. If they know your face, they know where you live within hours." "So, what?" I just disappear into your world because a stranger tried to kill you in a restaurant. I am not asking you to disappear into anything. His voice was quiet, stripped of the command it carried in crisis. I am asking you to survive the next few days somewhere they cannot reach you, while I make sure this does not become a longer problem than it already is. She should have argued harder. She should have demanded to be taken home regardless of the risk, should have insisted on calling the police, should have done any number of things that the woman she had been 12 hours earlier would have considered obvious. Instead, she found herself watching the city lights slide past the window and thinking, with a clarity that unsettled her, that she did not actually want to walk away from this yet, danger and all. The safe house, when they arrived, was nothing like she expected. A modest, unassuming brownstone in a quiet residential street, its windows dark and its exterior giving no hint of what it protected inside. Jiho led her through a side entrance into a sparsely furnished sitting room, and it was there, finally, with the adrenaline of the night beginning to drain out of her limbs and leave exhaustion in its place, that she felt the shaking in her hands return in full force. "Sit," he said, and for once there was no command in it, only quiet concern. He crossed his small bar cart and poured 2 glasses of something amber and expensive, handing one to her without asking if she wanted it. "You held together remarkably well for someone who had never been shot at before tonight. I've had practice staying calm under pressure. Just usually the pressure is a table of 8 complaining about their wine pairing." She took a sip, grateful for the burn of it against her throat.
Who is Choi exactly?
What does he actually want?
Territory.
Respect. Blood, eventually, if I let him get close enough to take it. Jiho sat across from her, his posture still carrying the coiled alertness of a man who had not fully stood down from the night's violence. "My organization controls trade routes through the docks that his family has wanted for 3 generations. My grandfather took that territory from his grandfather in a war neither of us were alive to witness, and the debt has never stopped accumulating interest. So, this isn't really about you at all."
No.
Something bitter crossed his expression. "It is about a war I inherited the way I inherited everything else in this life. I did not choose it any more than you chose to be at that restaurant tonight. But I am the one who has to end it, or it ends me instead." "You're wound," she said quietly, watching him. "The reason you sit with your back to the wall. The reason no one gets close to you. It's not just business, is it?" For a long moment he said nothing, staring into his glass, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone low and rough in a way she had not heard from him before. "6 years ago, I trusted a woman I should not have trusted with information that mattered more than her loyalty to me. She was not working for Choi directly, but she sold what she knew to someone who was. 3 of my men died because of what she gave away. I found out what she had done 2 days after I told her, for the first time, that I loved her." The rawness of it hung in the quiet room, and Marin understood, watching him, exactly what it had cost him to say those words aloud to someone he had known for barely a month. What happened to her? She is gone. That is all that matters. His eyes found hers, dark and unguarded in a way she had never seen them. "I built every wall I have around that mistake. I decided a long time ago that no one gets close enough to hurt me that way again. And then a waitress turned off a light switch in the middle of gunfire instead of running, and every wall I built stopped meaning very much at all." She set her glass down, aware of exactly how much weight that admission carried, and crossed the small distance between them to sit beside him rather than across from him. "I'm not her. I know that." His hand found hers, careful, deliberate, testing whether she would pull away. She did not. That is precisely the problem. They stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, the quiet of the safe house settling around them like something protective, and when he finally leaned down to kiss her, it was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled collision she might have expected after a night like tonight. It was slow, careful, a question posed rather than a demand made, and she answered it by closing the last inch of distance between them herself. The days that followed existed in a strange, suspended quality, neither entirely safe nor immediately dangerous, while Jiho's organization worked to track Choi's movements and Marin adjusted to a temporary life inside walls she had never expected to occupy. She learned, in fragments, the shape of the empire Jiho had inherited, the careful balance of loyalty and fear that kept it functioning, the weight of decisions he made daily that determined who lived and who did not. She learned that Taeyong had served his family for over a decade and would die before betraying it. She learned that Jiho took his coffee black and read before bed, and had not slept a full night through in longer than he could remember. On the second night, unable to sleep, she found him in the small kitchen at 2 a.m, a single lamp burning low over a stack of documents he was reviewing with the same intensity he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened in a way she had only seen once before, in the alley outside Varine. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you." She sat across from him, pulling the borrowed sweater he had given her tighter around herself. "What are you reading?" "Shipping manifests. Choi has been moving product through a route that used to belong exclusively to my family. I am trying to understand how he gained access to it." He set the papers down, studying her instead. "You do not have to sit with me. I know this is not the life you signed up for when you clocked in for a Friday shift." "No," she agreed. "But I'm here anyway." "Why?" She considered the question longer than she expected to. "Because for 6 years I've watched people walk through that dining room performing versions of themselves they think other people want to see. You've never once done that with me. Not even the first night, when you were being genuinely difficult about water temperature." A small, unwilling smile pulled at her mouth. "I don't know what to do with a man who doesn't perform. It's disarming." Something in his expression shifted, unguarded in a way that made her chest ache. "No one has called me disarming in a very long time." "Get used to it," she said, and meant it more than she expected to. She also learned, 4 days into her stay, that Choi had discovered exactly where she lived, because a man matching Taeyong's description of Choi's known enforcers had been seen outside her apartment building twice in one afternoon, and that single piece of information changed the calculation of everything. "He knows who you are to me," Jiho said, his voice tight with a fury she had not seen from him before, not even the night of the attack. "He will use you to draw me out into the open, somewhere he controls instead of somewhere I do." "Then let him," Marin said. "Better on my terms than his." "Absolutely not. You don't get to make that decision for me." She met his eyes without flinching, the same steadiness that had gotten her through 6 years of demanding tables and 1 very bad night of gunfire. "I have spent 4 days in this house watching you fight a war I got dragged into by accident. I am not going to spend the rest of it hiding while you decide what risks I'm allowed to take." What followed was an argument neither of them fully won, resolved eventually into a plan that gave her more agency than Jiho wanted to grant, and less than she initially demanded, a careful trap set at a warehouse near the docks where Choi believed he was luring Jiho into an ambush of his own design. Marin's role was small and specific, stationed at a distance with a single task, to trigger the warehouse's old fire alarm system at a precise moment that would scatter Choi's men into confusion exactly as Jiho's people moved in from the opposite side. The night of the operation arrived cold and clear, the docks quiet except for the distant groan of a container ship somewhere out on the water. Marin crouched in position behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, earpiece crackling faintly with Taeyong's low, steady updates on Choi's men taking position inside the warehouse, and found her hands, for the first time in 4 days, perfectly steady. She executed it perfectly, the alarm blaring through the warehouse at the exact second Jiho's men breached the loading doors, and in the chaos that followed, she watched from her hidden position as Choi's carefully planned ambush collapsed into disorganized retreat, watched Jiho move through the confusion with the same precise, lethal economy she had witnessed once already, watched him finally corner Choi himself against a stack of shipping containers with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. She did not hear everything that passed between them in that final confrontation, but she saw Choi's posture change from defiance to something smaller, saw him finally lower whatever weapon he had drawn, understood without needing the details that whatever terms Jiho dictated in that moment ended the war that had shadowed his entire adult life. She watched 2 of Choi's remaining men attempt to circle around toward Jiho's exposed flank, and without pausing to weigh the danger, she stepped from her hiding place and slammed the emergency release on a nearby loading crane, sending a suspended pallet crashing down into their path and buying Jiho the half-second he needed to finish what he had started. When it was over, when Choi's remaining men had scattered and the warehouse had gone quiet except for the fading wail of the fire alarm, Jiho crossed the distance to where she stood and pulled her against him with a force that told her exactly how afraid he had been of losing her, underneath all his careful command of the operation. "You are not supposed to be anywhere near that confrontation," he said against her hair. "I wasn't. I was exactly where the plan put me, until it needed adjusting." She pulled back to look at him, breathless and alive with an adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "It worked, Jiho. It's over." "It is over," he agreed, and something in his voice broke open, an admission of relief he did not bother hiding from her anymore. "And you are the reason it ended without costing me everything I have left to protect." "What happens now?" she asked. "Choi's people, the restaurant, all of it. What happens to us?" "Now," he said, his hand rising to trace the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt entirely earned after everything the night had cost them both, "I stop pretending that the woman who turned off a light switch to save my life is someone I am willing to let walk back into an ordinary life without me in it. If you will have it, if you will have me, knowing everything you now know about what that means." "I've known what it means since the first night I served your table," she said. "I stayed anyway." He kissed her there, in a warehouse still ringing faintly with a dying alarm, and it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned for and neither of them intended to walk away from now that they had found it. Outside, the docks stretched dark and quiet toward a harbor that no longer belonged to anyone but him, and inside, Marin Ashby stood in the arms of a man the whole city considered untouchable and understood that she had never once been afraid of him. She had only ever been afraid of what it would cost to want him. Now that the cost had been paid, she found she did not regret a single part of it, and for the first time since the night the doors of Varian had splintered open, she let herself believe that whatever came next, she would not be facing it as a bystander pulled into someone else's war, but as a woman who had chosen, with open eyes, exactly where she wanted to stand.